The piano keys trembled under Ezra's fingers, each note a fragile thread weaving through the smoky air of the Crescent Moon Jazz Lounge. 10 years ago, he'd vanished, swallowed by a world that presumed him dead. Now, in the heart of New Orleans, a stranger's gaze threatened to unravel the life he'd rebuilt. Ezra Jackson, 32, was no longer the reckless dreamer who'd fled New York a decade ago. His dark eyes, once bright with ambition, now carried the weight of secrets. He played in this dimly lit bar every Friday, his slim frame hunched over the old Steinway, coaxing melodies that made strangers weep. The crowd tonight was small, their murmurs blending with the clink of glasses. Ezra didn't notice the man in the tailored suit until he felt the air shift, a prickle of recognition he couldn't place. Julian Wentworth, 35, stood frozen at the bar's edge, his whiskey untouched. His sharp cheekbones and silver-flecked hair caught the amber light, but his eyes, storm gray and haunted, locked onto Ezra. Couldn't be. Julian had buried his heart 10 years ago, after the fire that claimed his lover, Miles. Yet there, under the flickering stage lights, was a ghost made flesh. The same curve of the jaw, the same quiet intensity in those fingers dancing across the keys. Julian's chest tightened, his pulse a drumbeat of hope and dread. Ezra finished his set, the final notes lingering like a question. He stood, brushing a hand through his close-cropped hair, and headed toward the bar for his usual water. That's when their eyes met. Julian's stare was a blade, cutting through the haze of Ezra's carefully guarded world. "Miles," Julian whispered, barely audible, but the name hit Ezra like a gunshot. "I'm sorry, you've got the wrong guy," Ezra said, his voice steady but his hands trembling as he gripped the glass. He turned away, heart pounding. Miles was a name he'd buried long ago, along with a life he could never reclaim. But Julian stepped closer, his presence commanding, magnetic. "You can't fool me," Julian said, his voice low, raw with something deeper than certainty. "I'd know you anywhere." His hand reached out, stopping short of Ezra's arm, as if afraid touching him would shatter the moment. Ezra's breath hitched. He wanted to run, to disappear again, but his feet wouldn't move. The bar's hum faded, leaving only the weight of Julian's gaze and the ghost of a life Ezra had left behind. 10 years ago he'd been Miles Carter, young, in love, and on the verge of a breakthrough as a composer in New York. He and Julian had been inseparable, their love a quiet rebellion against the world's expectations. But a fire in their apartment building had changed everything. Miles was presumed dead, his body never found. Ezra had chosen to let the world believe it, fleeing to protect a secret he could never share, not even with Julian. "I'm Ezra now," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Miles is gone." But the words felt hollow, and Julian's eyes burned with a truth Ezra couldn't escape. The bartender, a wiry woman named Clara, broke the tension. "Ezra, you okay?" she asked, eyeing Julian warily. Ezra nodded, forcing a smile, but his mind was spiraling. Julian wasn't just a memory, he was a billionaire now. His name splashed across headlines for his tech empire. Why was he here in a rundown jazz bar in New Orleans? And why did his presence feel like both salvation and ruin? Julian leaned closer, his voice a plea. "I don't know what happened or why you left, but I've spent 10 years mourning you. Give me one night to understand." His hand hovered near Ezra's, close enough to feel the warmth, but not crossing the line. Ezra's resolve wavered. He'd built this new life simple, safe, anonymous. But Julian's voice cracked open a wound he thought had healed. "One drink," Ezra said, his tone guarded. "Then you leave me alone." They sat in a corner booth, the air thick with unspoken questions. Julian spoke first, his words careful but heavy. "After the fire, they told me you were gone. I searched for you, hospitals, morgues, every lead. I didn't want to believe it. His fingers tightened around his glass. I built everything I have now to fill the void you left. But it was never enough. Ezra stared at the table, the wood grain blurring as memories flooded back. Julian's laughter in their tiny Brooklyn apartment, stolen kisses during late-night rehearsals, the way they dreamed of a future where their love didn't have to hide. But the fire hadn't just destroyed their home. It had exposed a truth Ezra couldn't face. He'd run, not from Julian, but from himself. I can't be who you want, Ezra said, his voice breaking. I'm not Miles anymore. Julian's hand finally closed over his, firm but gentle. Then let me know, Ezra. Let me know you. The words hung between them, a fragile bridge over a decade of pain. Ezra wanted to pull away, to protect the life he'd carved out. But Julian's touch was an anchor, grounding him in a past he couldn't outrun. As the bar's lights dimmed, signaling closing time, Ezra made a choice. He'd give Julian one night, not to rekindle what was lost, but to prove it was gone forever. But deep down he knew, one night might never be enough. The New Orleans night pressed against the windows of Ezra's small apartment, a cramped second-floor walk-up above a bakery. The scent of fresh beignet lingered in the air, mingling with the tension between the two men. Ezra sat on the edge of his worn couch, Julian perched on a rickety chair, the space between them charged with a decade's worth of unspoken truths. Julian's eyes roamed the room, taking in the sparse furnishings. A second-hand piano in the corner, a stack of sheet music, a single framed photo of a younger Ezra, smiling with a group of musicians. This is you now, Julian said. Not a question but a realization. No trace of Miles. Ezra's jaw tightened. Miles died in that fire. I told you, I'm someone else now. But the lie felt thinner with every word. He'd spent years perfecting this facade, blending into the rhythm of New Orleans, playing gigs to survive. Yet Julian's presence was a mirror, reflecting a man Ezra had tried to forget. Julian leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his tailored suit out of place in the modest room. I don't buy it, he said, his voice steady but laced with pain. You can change your name, your city, your story, but I know you. The way you play, the way your hands move, it's him. It's always been you. Ezra stood abruptly, crossing to the window to escape Julian's gaze. The street below buzzed with late-night revelers, their laughter a stark contrast to the storm in his chest. You don't know what happened, he said, his voice low. You don't know why I had to leave. Then tell me, Julian pressed, rising to his feet. I deserve that much. I loved you, Miles, Ezra, whatever you call yourself. I loved you, and you let me think you were dead. Ezra's hands clenched into fists. The truth was a weight he'd carried alone for 10 years, a secret that had driven him from New York and into the shadows. The fire hadn't just been an accident. It had been a warning. Miles Carter had been on the cusp of fame, his compositions gaining traction, but he'd crossed the wrong people. A shady producer, a deal gone sour, and a threat that left him no choice but to disappear. He'd let Julian believe he was dead to protect him, to keep him safe from the danger that had chased Miles out of his old life. I didn't want to leave you, Ezra said finally, turning to face Julian. His voice cracked, raw with the truth he'd buried. But I had no choice. There were people they would have come for you, too. Julian's expression softened, but his eyes burned with questions. Who? What were you running from? Ezra hesitated, the weight of the past pressing down. It doesn't matter now. They think I'm dead. I need to keep it that way. Julian stepped closer, closing the distance between them. It matters to me. You were my world, and you vanished. Do you know what that did to me? His voice trembled, not with anger but with the ache of years spent grieving. I built an empire, but it was empty without you. Ezra's throat tightened. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap, but fear held him back. "I'm not that person anymore," he said, though the words felt like a betrayal. "I can't be." Julian's hand found his, a tentative touch that sent a jolt through Ezra's body. "Then let me in. Let me know who you are now." For a moment, they stood there, the air thick with possibility. Ezra's heart raced, torn between the safety of his new life and the pull of a love he'd never stopped feeling. He pulled his hand away, stepping back. "You should go," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "This was a mistake." Julian's face fell, but he didn't move. "I'm not giving up on you," he said. "Not again." The next morning, Ezra woke to the sound of his phone buzzing. A text from an unknown number. "Meet me at Café du Monde, 10 a.m. We're not done." He knew it was Julian. He could ignore it, could keep running, but something in him stirred. A spark of the man he used to be, the man who'd loved Julian fiercely. He arrived at the cafe, the air thick with powdered sugar and the hum of tourists. Julian sat at a corner table, his polished exterior softened by the casual linen shirt he wore. He looked up as Ezra approached, his smile hesitant but warm. "You came," he said. Ezra sat, his guard still up. "What do you want, Julian? You can't just walk back into my life like this." "I want the truth," Julian said, leaning forward. "And I want you to stop running." Over coffee and beignet, Ezra began to talk. Not the full story, but pieces. The pressure of his old life, the threats that had driven him away, the fear that had kept him silent. Julian listened, his expression a mix of anger and empathy. When Ezra finished, Julian reached across the table, his touch steadying. "I would have fought for you," Julian said. "I still will." Ezra's heart ached with the weight of what could have been. But as they sat there, the city alive around them, he felt the first crack in the wall he'd built. Maybe, just maybe, he could let someone in again. The Mississippi River glittered under the midday sun, its surface a mirror for Ezra's tangled thoughts. He and Julian walked along the levee, the hum of New Orleans fading into the background. Every step felt like a tightrope, balancing between the pull of the past and the fragile safety of the present. Julian hadn't pushed for more answers since their talk at Café du Monde, but his presence was relentless, a quiet insistence that Ezra couldn't ignore. At 35, Julian carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd built a fortune, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there a decade ago. Ezra, at 32, felt like a shadow of his former self, his lean frame tense, his dark eyes wary. Yet Julian's gaze held him steady, a beacon in the storm of his memories. "You used to love the water," Julian said, breaking the silence. He gestured toward the river, where a paddleboat churned lazily downstream. "We'd sit by the Hudson for hours, planning our future." Ezra's lips twitched, almost a smile. That was a lifetime ago, but the memory stung. Nights spent dreaming of a world where they could be open, where Miles Carter's music would light up stages and Julian would be by his side. That dream had burned to ash, and Ezra had built a new one, solitary but safe. Julian stopped walking, turning to face him. "I know you're scared," he said, his voice low, urgent. "But you don't have to do this alone anymore. Whatever you're running from, we can face it together." Ezra's chest tightened. He wanted to believe it, to let Julian's strength anchor him. But the past was a ghost that wouldn't stay buried. "You don't know what you're asking," he said. "There are people who'd kill to keep their secrets. I can't drag you into that." Julian's jaw set, his eyes fierce. "I'm already in it. The moment I saw you in that bar, I was in it." Ezra looked away, the river blurring as his emotions churned. He hadn't told Julian everything. Not about the producer, Victor Kane, who'd threatened his life over a deal gone wrong. Not about the men who'd set the fire, intending to silence him. Ezra had escaped, barely, and let the world think Miles Carter was dead. But Victor was still out there, a shadow Ezra could never outrun. That night, Ezra played another set at the Crescent Moon. The crowd was larger, the air electric with anticipation. Julian sat in the back, his presence a quiet pulse in the room. Ezra's fingers flew across the keys, each note a confession he couldn't voice. The music was raw, unfiltered, and when he finished, the applause was deafening. As he stepped off the stage, a woman approached, mid-40s, sharp-eyed, with a sleek bob and a tailored blazer. "Ezra Jackson?" she asked, her tone professional but edged with curiosity. "I'm Lauren Tate with NOLA Arts. You're playing It's Extraordinary. I'd love to talk about a showcase opportunity." Ezra froze, his instincts screaming to retreat. Exposure was dangerous. Attention was a spotlight he couldn't afford. "I'm just a bar pianist," he said, forcing a casual tone. "Not looking for the big stage." Lauren's smile didn't waver. "Think about it. You've got something special." She handed him a card and left, but her words lingered, stirring a longing Ezra thought he'd buried. Julian approached, his expression unreadable. "You could have been a star," he said softly. "You still could be." Ezra shook his head, brushing past him. "That's not my life anymore." But Julian's words followed him home, a reminder of the dreams he'd abandoned. The next day, Ezra found himself at Julian's hotel, a sleek high-rise overlooking the French Quarter. Julian had invited him to talk, promising answers about his own life since the fire. The suite was all glass and marble, a stark contrast to Ezra's modest world. Julian poured them both coffee, his movements deliberate. "I didn't just come to New Orleans on a whim," Julian admitted, sitting across from Ezra. "I've been tracking rumors, whispers of a pianist with your style. I didn't believe it at first, but I had to know." Ezra's heart sank. "You've been looking for me?" "For years," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every lead, every dead end. When I saw you play, I knew it was you. I'd know your music anywhere." Ezra's hands trembled, the coffee untouched. "You need to stop. If the wrong people find out I'm alive." "Then let me help you," Julian interrupted. "I have resources, connections. We can end this, whatever it is." Ezra wanted to believe him, but fear was a chain around his heart. He stood, ready to leave, but Julian's hand caught his wrist, gentle but firm. "Don't run again," Julian said, his voice breaking. "Not from me." For a moment, Ezra let himself feel it. The warmth of Julian's touch, the promise of a life where he didn't have to hide. But the weight of his secret was too heavy. He pulled away, leaving the hotel with a storm of emotions he couldn't name. The New Orleans heat clung to Ezra's skin as he walked through the French Quarter, the city's pulse a stark contrast to the chaos in his mind. Julian's words echoed, a siren call to a life he'd left behind. But the past wasn't just a memory. It was a threat, and Ezra felt its shadow closing in. He hadn't slept after leaving Julian's hotel. Instead, he'd sat at his piano, fingers tracing silent melodies, each note a question he couldn't answer. Could he trust Julian? Could he risk everything for a chance at the life they'd once dreamed of? The answer lay buried in a decade of fear, and Ezra wasn't sure he was strong enough to unearth it. At the Crescent Moon that evening, the bar was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Ezra's set was electric, his music a raw outpouring of everything he couldn't say. Julian was there again, his presence a steady anchor in the crowd. But so was someone else. A man in a dark jacket, his face half hidden in the shadows, watching Ezra with an intensity that made his skin crawl. After the set, Ezra slipped out the back, his heart pounding. He'd seen that man before, years ago in New York, a hired thug working for Victor Kane. The realization hit like ice water. His past had found him. He ducked into an alley, his breath shallow, but footsteps followed, deliberate and unhurried. Ezra Jackson. A voice called, low and menacing. Or should I say Miles Carter? Ezra froze, turning to face the man. He was broad-shouldered, with a scar cutting across his brow, his eyes cold. Victor sends his regards, the man said, stepping closer. You've been a hard man to find. Ezra's mind raced. He could run, but where? He'd built this life to be invisible. But Julian's return had changed everything. What do you want? Ezra asked, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at him. The man smirked. Victor doesn't like loose ends. You're supposed to be dead. Before Ezra could respond, a figure emerged from the shadows. Julian, his face set with a fury Ezra had never seen. Back off, Julian said, his voice a low growl. He stepped between Ezra and the man, his presence commanding despite the danger. The thug laughed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. This doesn't concern you, rich boy. It does, Julian said, his tone unwavering. He's with me. The standoff lasted seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, the man backed away, disappearing into the night with a promise. This isn't over. Ezra's knees buckled, and Julian caught him, his arms steady. We need to talk, Julian said, guiding Ezra to a nearby bench. The city hummed around them, oblivious to the near disaster. Who was that? What's going on? Ezra's breath came in shaky bursts. He told Julian everything, the deal with Victor Kane, the threats, the fire meant to kill him. I ran to protect you, Ezra said, his voice raw. I couldn't let them hurt you. Julian's face was a storm of emotions. Anger, pain, love. You should have told me, he said. I would have fought for us. I didn't want you to die for me, Ezra whispered. Julian's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. I'm here now, he said, and I'm not going anywhere. The next day, Julian took charge, his billionaire resources a weapon Ezra couldn't wield alone. He hired a private investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Rachel, to dig into Victor Kane's operations. They met in a discreet office, Rachel laying out files that detailed Victor's empire, shady deals, blackmail, and a network of enforcers. He's powerful, Rachel said, but not untouchable. Ezra felt a flicker of hope, but fear still lingered. What if he finds out we're looking into him? Julian's eyes met his, resolute. Then we fight. Together. That night, Ezra invited Julian to his apartment, a tentative step toward trust. They sat at the piano, Ezra playing a soft melody while Julian watched, his presence a balm to Ezra's frayed nerves. This is who I am now, Ezra said, his fingers pausing on the keys. Not Miles, not a star, just me. Julian leaned closer, his breath warm against Ezra's cheek. I love you, whoever you are. The words broke something in Ezra, a wall he'd built to survive. He turned, their faces inches apart, and for the first time in a decade, he let himself feel. Their kiss was slow, tentative, a reclaiming of something lost but never forgotten. But as they pulled apart, Ezra's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. You can't hide forever. The threat was a cold reminder that their fight was far from over. The threat hung over Ezra like a storm cloud, but Julian's presence was a shield, steady and unyielding. They stood together in Ezra's apartment, the city's lights flickering through the window as they planned their next move. Ezra, 32, felt the weight of his past pressing down, but Julian, 35, was a force of conviction, his storm-gray eyes alight with determination. Rachel, the private investigator, had uncovered enough to build a case against Victor Kane. Bank records, encrypted emails, witnesses willing to talk. Victor's empire was crumbling, but he was dangerous when cornered. "We need to move fast," Rachel said. Her voice clipped as she spread documents across Ezra's kitchen table. "He knows you're alive, Ezra. He'll come for you." Ezra's hands trembled, but Julian's touch grounded him. "We're ready," Julian said, his voice firm. "He won't touch you." The plan was risky. Lure Victor into the open, record his confession, and deliver it to the authorities. Rachel had contacts in the FBI, and Julian's wealth ensured protection. But Ezra's fear was a living thing, clawing at his resolve. He'd spent a decade hiding, and now he was stepping into the light. They chose the Crescent Moon as the stage, a place where Ezra's music could draw Victor out. The bar was packed the night of the sting, the air thick with anticipation. Ezra took the stage, his fingers steady on the keys despite the storm in his chest. He played a new piece, one he'd written for Julian, a melody of loss, love, and redemption. The crowd was spellbound, but Ezra's eyes searched for Victor. He appeared in the shadows, his presence a chill down Ezra's spine. Victor was older now, his face lined but his eyes as cold as ever. He approached the stage after the set, his smile ablaze. "Miles Carter," he said, his voice low, "you've caused me a lot of trouble." Ezra's heart pounded, but he held his ground, the hidden recorder in his pocket capturing every word. "I'm done running," he said. "What do you want?" Victor leaned closer, his voice a hiss. "You should have stayed dead. That fire was a warning, and you didn't listen." Before Victor could say more, Julian stepped forward, his presence commanding. "It's over, Kane," he said, his voice steady. Rachel signaled from the back, and two plainclothes agents moved in, their badges glinting in the dim light. Victor's face twisted with rage, but he was cornered, his confession recorded. As the agents led Victor away, Ezra's knees buckled, relief flooding through him. Julian caught him, his arms a safe harbor. "It's done," Julian whispered. "You're free." The days that followed were a blur of statements and interviews, but Ezra felt lighter with each passing hour. Victor's arrest made headlines, his empire unraveling as more witnesses came forward. Ezra's secret was out, but for the first time, he didn't feel like a ghost. He and Julian walked along the Mississippi one evening, the river a quiet witness to their new beginning. "I don't know what comes next," Ezra admitted, his voice soft. "I've been Ezra so long. I'm not sure who Miles was." Julian stopped, turning to face him. "You're both," he said, his hand cupping Ezra's cheek. "And I love every part of you." Ezra smiled, a real smile, the kind he hadn't felt in years. He thought of the music he'd stopped writing, the dreams he'd buried. Maybe it was time to unearth them, to let himself be seen. Lauren Tate's offer of a showcase lingered in his mind, a chance to step back into the world. Not as Miles, not as Ezra, but as himself. A month later, Ezra stood on a stage in a small New Orleans theater, the spotlight warm on his skin. Julian sat in the front row, his smile a beacon. Ezra's fingers found the keys, and the music poured out. A story of loss, survival, and love reclaimed. The crowd rose to their feet, their applause a wave that carried Ezra forward. Backstage, Julian pulled him into a kiss, fierce and full of promise. "You did it," he said, his voice thick with pride. "We did it," Ezra corrected, his heart full. They walked into the night, hand in hand, the city alive around them. Ezra didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a decade, he wasn't afraid to find out. Love had brought him back from the ashes, and together, they'd write a new song, one that echoed with hope and the courage to live openly, unapologetically, as themselves.